In the summer of 1945, the world stood on the edge of something no one had ever witnessed before. For nearly 6 years, the Second World War had consumed entire continents, reshaped nations, and taken millions of lives. Cities burned across Europe and Asia, and every major power searched desperately for a way to end the conflict. Yet even in the chaos of global war, few people could imagine that a single weapon would soon possess the power to destroy an entire city in seconds. In Japan, daily life continued under the constant shadow of air raids and shortages, but many civilians still woke each morning hoping the war would end before something even worse arrived. Among them was a quiet engineer named. He worked for a large shipbuilding company and had spent months traveling for wartime assignments. In early August, he found himself in the city on a routine business trip, preparing to return home after completing his work. It was supposed to be his final day there. The morning air was calm, the streets slowly filling with workers and cyclists beginning another ordinary day. No one realized that in just a few hours, the sky above the city would unleash a force unlike anything humanity had ever created. Within moments, an entire city would vanish into fire and smoke. And one man's life would be changed forever. Yet what makes this story truly unbelievable is not simply that he survived the first explosion, but what would happen to him only 3 days later. On the morning of August 6th, was walking through an industrial district as he prepared to leave the city. His business trip had ended, and he was looking forward to returning home to his family at around 8:15 in the morning. Something unusual caught his attention in the sky. A single American bomber had appeared overhead, flying high above the city. Air raid sirens had sounded earlier that morning, but when only a few planes were spotted, many residents believed there was little danger. Yamaguchi looked up, confused by the lone aircraft gliding silently through the clear blue sky. Then suddenly, a small object dropped from the plane. For a brief moment, it drifted downward almost gently, suspended against the bright sunlight. What happened next would become one of the most devastating moments in human history. A blinding flash exploded across the sky, brighter than the sun itself. In an instant, a massive fireball erupted above the city as the atomic bomb known as Little Boy detonated. The blast wave slammed through the streets with unimaginable force, crushing buildings, shattering glass, and throwing people violently to the ground. Yamaguchi was knocked unconscious by the explosion. His body burned and injured as the shockwave tore through the area around him. When he regained consciousness, the city he had walked through just moments earlier had become a landscape of destruction. As he struggled to stand, could barely comprehend what he was seeing. Entire blocks of buildings had collapsed, flames were spreading rapidly through the ruins, and thick black smoke climbed high into the sky. People wandered through the shattered streets in shock, many injured, burned, or desperately searching for loved ones. The explosion had unleashed temperatures hotter than anything the city had ever experienced, igniting fires across vast areas of. Yet somehow, despite the force of the blast and the burns on his body, Yamaguchi had survived. His eardrums were damaged, his skin severely burned, and debris had injured his face and arms. Still, he was alive. Like thousands of others, he staggered through the destroyed city searching for help. The once familiar streets were nearly unrecognizable. twisted metal and broken buildings replacing the neighborhoods that had stood there only hours before. Throughout the day and night that followed, survivors gathered wherever shelter could be found, trying to treat injuries and understand what had happened. No one yet knew that a completely new kind of weapon had been used against them. But for Yamaguchi, one thought remained constant through the pain and confusion. He had to get home. His wife and young child were waiting for him hundreds of kilometers away. Somehow, despite the devastation around him, he began planning the impossible journey back. Against all odds, the very next day, managed to reach a functioning train station outside the ruins of. Rail lines across Japan had been damaged by wartime bombing, but some routes were still operating. Covered in bandages and struggling with severe pain, he boarded a crowded train filled with other survivors attempting to leave the destroyed city. During the long journey west, the passengers shared stories of what they had witnessed. Many described the same terrifying moment, a sudden flash of light, followed by an explosion powerful enough to flatten entire neighborhoods. Yet no one truly understood the scale of what had occurred. By the time the train finally arrived Yamaguchi had endured nearly 2 days of exhaustion, injury, and shock. When he reached his home, his family was stunned to see the condition he was in, burned and barely able to walk. He spent the night recovering and telling them about the nightmare he had survived. The next morning, despite his injuries, he reported to his workplace to explain why he had returned late from his trip. His supervisor listened as Yamaguchi described the blinding flash and the massive explosion that had destroyed. At first, the story sounded almost impossible to believe. But as he spoke, describing a single bomb powerful enough to destroy an entire city, something else was already approaching high above the skies of Nagasaki. On the morning of August 9th, just 3 days after the destruction of, was standing inside an office building and explaining what he had witnessed. His co-workers listened in disbelief as he described the massive flash of light and the unimaginable power of the explosion that had destroyed the city. Some thought the story sounded exaggerated, others wondered whether a new type of bomb had truly been used. But before the conversation could continue, the sky outside suddenly filled with a brilliant white light. In an instant, the room erupted in blinding brightness as another atomic bomb detonated high above the city. The weapon known as Fat Man had exploded over, unleashing a second catastrophic blast. Windows shattered violently across the building as the shockwave thundered through the city. Walls trembled, dust and debris crashed down from the ceiling. And terrified workers threw themselves to the floor for protection. For Yamaguchi, the moment must have felt surreal beyond comprehension. Just 3 days earlier, he had survived the most powerful weapon ever used in war. And now, somehow, he had found himself at the center of a second atomic explosion. When the shockwave finally passed, chaos spread through the streets just as it had in Hiroshima. Buildings were damaged or destroyed, fires ignited across the city, and thick smoke rose high into the sky. Once again, had been thrown violently by the force of the blast. Yet incredibly, he was still alive. The injuries he had already suffered days earlier had not killed him. And now he had survived a second atomic detonation. Outside the building, the city was descending into the same nightmare he had witnessed before. People ran through the streets searching for safety as smoke and dust filled the air. Emergency responders struggled to reach the wounded while fires spread through damaged neighborhoods. For many survivors, the destruction seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Few people yet understood that these explosions were the result of nuclear weapons capable of releasing energy on a scale humanity had never seen before. But in the middle of that devastation, Yamaguchi once again began the difficult task of helping his family and surviving the aftermath. In the days that followed, the world slowly began to understand the true scale of what had happened. The atomic bombings of and would soon force Japan to surrender, bringing the Second World War to an end. But for the people who lived through those explosions, the scars would last a lifetime, eventually recovered from his injuries and returned to a quiet life with his family. For many years he rarely spoke publicly about what he had experienced. Surviving 2 atomic bombings seemed almost impossible, yet medical records and eyewitness accounts confirmed that he had indeed been present in both cities when the bombs detonated. Decades later, his story became widely known as one of the most extraordinary survival stories in modern history. It was not a tale of heroism or victory, but a reminder of the unimaginable power humanity had unleashed during war. The man who had survived 2 atomic explosions would spend the rest of his life sharing a simple message: that the world should never again witness such destruction. And even today, the story of the man who lived through both atomic bombings continues to astonish historians and remind us just how fragile survival can be in the face of history's most powerful forces. In the weeks after the explosions that destroyed Japan entered a period of silence, shock, and surrender. The Second World War, which had consumed the world for years, was finally coming to an end. Cities across the country were struggling to recover from devastation, and millions of people were trying to rebuild lives that had been shattered almost overnight. Among them was a man whose survival seemed almost impossible. After enduring 2 atomic explosions within 3 days, his body carried painful reminders of the events he had witnessed. Burns covered parts of his skin, his hearing had been damaged by the blasts, and exhaustion followed him for months as he slowly regained his strength. Yet compared to the enormous number of people who had lost their lives in both cities, he considered himself fortunate simply to be alive. Life in post-war Japan was difficult for everyone. Food was scarce, infrastructure had been destroyed, and families across the country were mourning loved ones who never returned. For many survivors of the bombings, speaking about what they had experienced was almost too painful. Like countless others, Yamaguchi focused on rebuilding his life quietly. He returned to work, raised his family, and tried to move forward in a world that had changed forever. For years, his story remained largely unknown outside his small circle of friends and colleagues. Surviving 2 atomic bombs seemed so unbelievable that few people even realized such a thing had happened. As decades passed, the world slowly entered a new and uncertain era known as the nuclear age. The terrifying power first revealed above and would shape global politics, military strategy, and international relations for generations. Nations raced to develop their own nuclear weapons, creating arsenals capable of destroying the planet many times over. Yet amid those global tensions, Survivors of the atomic bombings carried memories that the rest of the world could only try to imagine. In Japan, these survivors became known as hibakusha, people directly affected by the nuclear explosions. Many of them spent their lives speaking about the horrors they had witnessed, hoping to prevent future nuclear wars. For much of his life, remained relatively quiet about his experiences. He rarely sought attention and preferred to live a normal life with his wife and children. But as the years passed and historians began documenting the events of 1945 more carefully, his extraordinary survival began to attract attention. Reports confirmed that he had indeed been present in both cities when the atomic bombs detonated. Gradually, the story that once seemed impossible started to gain recognition around the world. People were astonished to learn that one man had endured the unimaginable twice, and lived to tell the story. Eventually, decided that his experiences carried an important message for future generations. In interviews and public appearances later in life, he spoke about the moment the sky above erupted in blinding light, and how that single flash changed the course of history. He described the confusion and terror that followed, the destruction of entire neighborhoods, and the painful journey back home too. Most of all, he spoke about the strange and almost unbelievable moment when a second flash filled the sky just days later. For audiences around the world, the idea of surviving 2 atomic bombs sounded almost like something from fiction. Yet his calm voice and detailed memories reminded listeners that these events were very real, and that the devastation of nuclear weapons had once been unleashed upon ordinary cities filled with ordinary people. His story became a powerful reminder of the human side of history, a perspective often lost when discussing wars and military strategy. Instead of statistics and political decisions, his experience revealed the reality faced by individuals caught in the middle of world-changing events. When passed away in 2010 at the age of 93, he left behind one of the most remarkable survival stories in modern history. The man who had once walked through the ruins of 2 destroyed cities had lived long enough to see the world reflect on the consequences of those weapons. Today, the atomic bombings of and remain among the most studied and debated events of the 20th century. Historians continue to examine their role in ending the war, while scientists and world leaders grapple with the ongoing risks of nuclear technology. But within that enormous historical discussion, the story of one survivor still stands out. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by governments and armies, but also by the lives of individuals who endure extraordinary circumstances. And perhaps the most astonishing part of that story is this: that in a war defined by unimaginable destruction, one man somehow survived the power of 2 atomic bombs, and lived to tell the world what it truly meant.